He used to break men with a single look. Now Dominic Russo couldn't even pour his own whiskey. The bullet that severed his spine was supposed to end his reign, turning a feared syndicate boss into a ghost trapped in a wheelchair. His enemies were circling, his capos were whispering, and his new wife, Claire, was supposed to be nothing more than a pawn. But late one night, in the suffocating silence of his bedroom, he whispered a confession that shattered everything they knew about each other. The rubber tires of the wheelchair made a distinct synthetic hiss against the imported Italian marble. It was a quiet sound, insidious. To Claire, it had become the metronome of her new life. She sat in the leather wingback chair in the corner of the vast library, a book open on her lap, its pages unturned for the last 20 minutes. She was watching her husband. Dominic Russo was positioned by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the rain-slicked streets of the city he supposedly still owned. From the chest up, he was exactly the man her father had promised her to. Broad shoulders wrapped in a charcoal bespoke suit. A sharp, unforgiving jawline, shadowed by a dark scruff, he no longer bothered to have the barber meticulously trim. Hair the color of wet coal eyes, like chipped flint. He looked like violence. From the waist down, he was a monument to gravity. His legs, clad in trousers that had been expertly tailored to hide the gradual atrophy of the muscles, sat perfectly still on the footrests. They didn't twitch. They didn't shift to accommodate his weight. They were just there. Anchors keeping a drowning man tethered to the floor. It had been 6 months since the ambush outside a downtown steakhouse. 4 months since their wedding, a sterile, grim affair conducted in the private chapel of this very estate, with Dominic sitting rigidly in his chair at the altar, while Claire's father essentially handed over the deed to her life to settle a $2 million gambling debt. Claire had prepared herself to be the wife of a monster. She had braced for brutality, for coldness, for the terrifying reality of being married to the head of the Russo crime family. She hadn't braced for the silence. Dominic reached for a crystal decanter of bourbon resting on a side table. The table was just an inch too far. He leaned, his core muscles engaged, rigid and straining, but without the counterbalance of his lower body, the movement was precarious. His fingers brushed the heavy glass. Claire's instinct was to stand, to walk over, pour the drink, and place it in his hand. But she stayed frozen. She had learned early on that pity was the one thing Dominic Russo punished with absolute ruthlessness. To help him was to remind him that he needed help. He gritted his teeth. A vein pulsed thick at his temple. He shoved the wheel of his chair forward with a vicious, sudden jerk. The metal footrest slammed into the mahogany side table. The decanter rattled, tipping dangerously before settling back on its heavy base. Dominic grabbed the neck of the bottle, poured a suffocating amount of amber liquid into a glass, and slammed the decanter back down. He didn't look back at her. He didn't have to. Say it. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It sounded like stones grinding together. Claire closed her book. I didn't say anything. Your breathing changed, Dominic said, taking a slow sip of the bourbon. You hold your breath when you think I'm going to embarrass myself, Claire. You do it every time. I hold my breath because you have a temper, she replied evenly. Her voice didn't shake. That was her one point of pride in this house. She refused to tremble for him. And I prefer not to be in the crossfire when you decide to throw a $300 bottle of liquor at the wall. Dominic turned the chair. He did it with the fluid mechanical grace of a man who had spent hundreds of hours mastering the machinery he despised. The chrome rims caught the dim light of the library. He stared at her across the expanse of the Persian rug. I don't throw things, he said quietly. Not since Tuesday, Claire corrected. A heavy silence fell between them. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of newlyweds. It was a battlefield. Every word was a landmine, every glance a calculated risk. Dominic took another drink, his eyes scanning her face, looking for the cracks. He was always looking for the cracks. He expected her to break, to cry, to beg for her freedom. He expected her to look at him the way his enemies did, like a wounded animal waiting to be put out of its misery. But Claire just looked back. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the chronic exhaustion of a man whose body was constantly fighting nerve pain that medication couldn't entirely mask. She saw the way his left hand gripped the armrest knuckles, white, grounding himself. "The physical therapist is coming at 4, Claire said, shifting the subject. She stood up, smoothing the skirt of her dark dress. "Cancel him." "Dominic, I said cancel him, Claire. I have a sit-down with Carmine and the crew in an hour. I don't have the time to let a 25-year-old kid in a polo shirt stretch my dead legs like a puppet." The bitterness in his voice was raw, unfiltered. "The doctor said if you stop the therapy, the contractures will get worse. You'll lose the flexibility you have left." "Flexibility for what?" Dominic snapped his voice, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He slammed the heavy crystal glass onto the table, the bourbon sloshing over the rim. "So I can do a high kick, so I can run a marathon." "The cord is severed, Claire. It's gone. Moving my legs around so they look pretty in a suit isn't going to change the fact that I'm glued to this metal frame for the rest of my miserable life." Claire walked toward him. She didn't hurry and she didn't hesitate. She stopped 3 feet from his chair, close enough to smell the bourbon and the faint, sterile scent of antiseptic that always seemed to cling to him now. "You will do the therapy," she said, her voice dropping to a register that matched his in sheer, stubborn gravity. "Because Carmine is coming in an hour, and if you let your muscles tighten up, your legs will spasm during the meeting. And if they spasm, you'll look weak. You don't want to look weak in front of Carmine." Dominic's jaw tightened. He glared at her, a flare of genuine, dangerous anger lighting up the deadened flint of his eyes. He hated that she was right. He hated that she understood the politics of his world well enough to use them against him. But mostly, he hated that she saw the mechanical failures of his body so clearly. 4 o'clock, he muttered, turning his chair back to the window. "Tell him to use the side entrance." Claire nodded, though he couldn't see it. "I'll have Maria prepare the coffee for the meeting." She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Just as her hand touched the brass handle, his voice drifted across the room, quieter this time, stripped of the venom. "I didn't ask for you to be locked in this cage with me, Claire." She paused her back to him. She closed her eyes for a brief second, gathering herself. "I know," she said. And then she walked out, leaving him alone in the dark. The dining room had been converted into a boardroom. The grand mahogany table, which could comfortably seat 20, was stripped of its silk runners and floral centerpieces. Instead, it was cluttered with ledgers, blueprints, and the heavy tension of ambitious men. Dominic sat at the head of the table. His wheelchair was pulled in tight, the armrests neatly aligned with the edge of the wood. From the chest up, he was the undisputed boss. His posture was rigid, his gaze cutting through the cigar smoke that hung thick in the air. Claire stood near the sideboard, a silent shadow pouring espresso into demitasse cups. She was the only woman in the room ignored by the 5 men at the table, which was exactly how she wanted it. It allowed her to watch. Carmine the underboss sat to Dominic's immediate right. Carmine was a man built like a fire hydrant with a thick neck and eyes that constantly darted around the room, assessing, calculating. He had been Dominic's father's most trusted lieutenant, and now he was supposed to be Dominic's. But loyalty in the syndicate was tied to strength, and strength was entirely physical. The union rep is pushing back on the South Boston development. Carmine said, tapping a thick, gold-ringed finger against a ledger. Says the envelope is too light this month. He's threatening a strike on Monday. Then you remind him why he accepts the envelope in the first place, Dominic said smoothly. His voice was a weapon calibrated perfectly, cold, reasonable, terrifying. Tell him a strike means his crew doesn't get paid, and if his crew doesn't get paid, they'll start looking for new leadership. Someone more cooperative. I told him that. Carmine sighed, leaning back in his chair. He took a slow drag of his cigar. But he's getting bold, Dom. People hear things. They think things are shifting. The temperature in the room plummeted. The other three capos at the table, Vitiello Russo's cousin, Paulie, and a silent enforcer named Trent, suddenly found their coffee cups incredibly interesting. No one looked at Dominic. Claire stopped pouring. The silver pot hovered over a cup. What things exactly are people hearing, Carmine? Dominic asked. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by a terrifying softness. Carmine shrugged, feigning a casualness that rang entirely hollow. You know how it is? You ain't been seen down at the clubs in months. You ain't been to the docks. When the boss manages the family from his living room, people start to wonder if he's still got the stomach for the street. Carmine's eyes drifted downward briefly before flicking back to Dominic's face. It was a micro-expression, lasting no more than a second, but it was deafening. He had looked at the chair. Dominic's hands rested flat on the table. Claire saw his knuckles whiten. He was preparing to speak, to assert dominance, to rhetorically cut Carmine off at the knees. But then the betrayal came from within. It started as a subtle tremor completely out of Dominic's control, a misfiring of damaged nerves in his spinal cord. His right leg twitched. Claire saw it instantly. The fabric of his trousers pulled taut against his thigh. Dominic's jaw locked. He clamped his hands down harder on the table, trying to shift his weight, trying to force his torso to counteract the spasm below his waist. But the tremor escalated into a violent, rigid kick. His heavy leather-shod foot slammed upward, hitting the underside of the heavy mahogany table with a dull, hollow thud. The sound silenced the room. Carmine stopped mid-drag on his cigar. Vitiello looked up. Dominic froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. A bead of sweat broke out at his hairline. He was trapped. He couldn't feel the leg, couldn't stop it, couldn't apologize for it. It was a glaring neon sign of his absolute lack of control over his own vessel. The silence stretched thick and humiliating. Carmine's eyes narrowed, the pity mixing with a sudden, predatory glint. The underboss opened his mouth to speak, to offer some condescending platitude about Dominic needing rest. Claire moved. She didn't think. She just reacted. She stepped forward, deliberately catching the toe of her heel on the edge of the thick Persian rug. With a sharp gasp, she stumbled, throwing her weight forward. The silver tray in her hands tilted. 3 porcelain cups of scalding espresso, a cream pitcher, and a bowl of sugar cubes launched into the air. They crashed onto the center of the table in a spectacular cacophony of shattering china and splashing black liquid. Jesus Christ, Carmine shouted, jumping out of his chair as the hot coffee splashed across his ledger and dotted his silk tie. The other men scrambled back, brushing at their suits. I am so sorry. Claire gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in a perfect portrait of mortified panic. She grabbed a linen napkin and started frantically dabbing at the table, deliberately leaning directly in front of Dominic, entirely shielding his lower half from the view of the men. My heel caught the rug. I'm so clumsy. Carmine, your tie, I am so sorry. Forget the tie, just get some towels. Carmine grumbled, looking annoyed, but successfully distracted. Under the cover of the chaos shielded by Claire's body, Dominic reached down. His hands clamped onto his right thigh, locking the spasming leg in place, forcing it back down to the footrest with brutal force. He held it there until the muscle finally surrendered and went limp. He looked up at Claire. She was still apologizing to Paulie, furiously wiping up spilled sugar. She didn't look at Dominic. She didn't seek a silent, "Thank you. All right, enough." Dominic barked, his voice loud, breaking through the commotion. The capos stopped complaining and looked back at him. Dominic's hands were back on the table steady. His face was a mask of cold annoyance. "Claire, leave it. Get Maria to clean this up," Dominic ordered. He didn't sound grateful. He sounded like a boss dismissing a clumsy servant. "Yes, Dominic," she murmured, bowing her head submissively before backing away and leaving the room. As the heavy dining room doors clicked shut behind her, Claire leaned back against the cool hallway wall and let out a shaky breath. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She had saved his pride, but she knew Dominic Russo well enough by now to know one undeniable truth. He was going to make her pay for witnessing his weakness. Midnight in the Russo estate was a heavy, suffocating thing. The guards patrolled the perimeter, leaving the interior of the house feeling like a hermetically sealed vault. Claire sat at the mahogany vanity in her silk nightgown, pulling a brush through her hair. The bedroom they shared was massive, an expanse of dark wood, heavy velvet drapes, and a king-sized bed that felt more like a raft lost at sea. Dominic was already in bed. The night nurse, a discreet man named Thomas, had finished the evening routine. An hour ago, the transfer from the chair, the catheter care, the positioning of pillows to prevent pressure sores. Things a wife would normally do things, Dominic vehemently forbade Claire from ever witnessing or assisting with. He was propped up against the headboard, a file folder resting on his chest, but his eyes were fixed entirely on Claire's reflection in the vanity mirror. He was angry. He had been radiating a quiet, toxic hostility since the meeting ended. "You think you're clever?" Dominic finally spoke. His voice cut through the quiet room like a serrated knife. Claire didn't stop brushing her hair. "I don't know what you mean. The rug. The tray." He sneered. He tossed the file onto the mattress. "You think you played Carmine? You think you played all of them? What you expect a Medal A thank you card?" Claire set the brush down with a quiet click. She turned around on the padded stool to face him. "I expect you to stop looking for a fight where there isn't one." I tripped. "Bullshit." Dominic's hands fisted in the heavy duvet. His chest heaved. "You saw me lose control. You saw that twitch, and you threw yourself at the table like a goddamn martyr to protect my fragile ego, to hide the cripple from the wolves. I was protecting the family's interests," Claire said, keeping her voice even. She knew better than to raise it. When he got like this, he was looking for a screaming match. He was looking to exert control over something, someone, since he couldn't control himself. If Carmine thinks you are weak, he moves against you. If he moves against you, there's a war. I live in this house too, Dominic. I'd prefer it not be shot up. Oh, you're a strategist now. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. My little bride playing mob boss from the sidelines. Let me tell you something, Claire. Carmine didn't buy the clumsy act. He knows. They all know. They know you run the city, she countered. They know I'm half a man. He roared. The silence that followed was deafening. The words hung in the air, raw and bleeding. It was the first time he had said it out loud. The first time he had vocalized the rot that was eating him alive from the inside out. Dominic's head fell back against the headboard. The fight seemed to instantly drain out of him, leaving behind something far more terrifying, absolute defeat. He closed his eyes. The shadows in the room made the hollows of his cheeks look like skulls. You should leave, he whispered. Claire froze. What? I'll have my lawyers draft the papers tomorrow. An annulment. Divorce. Whatever you want. He didn't open his eyes. He sounded exhausted. I'll give you $500,000. A house in upstate New York. A new name if you want it. Your father's debt is clear. You don't owe me anything anymore. Claire stood up. The silk of her nightgown whispered against her legs as she walked toward the bed. I am your wife. You're a hostage, Dominic corrected bitterly. He finally opened his eyes, looking at her as she stopped at the edge of the mattress. Look at me, Claire. Really look at me. I'm 32 years old and my life is over. I can't walk. I can't protect myself. I have a stranger empty a plastic bag attached to my leg twice a day, so I don't poison my own kidneys. He swallowed hard, his throat working. He looked away, his jaw tightening. You're 24. You're beautiful. You're supposed to have a life. Children. A husband who can actually be a husband. I don't want a house in upstate New York, Claire said quietly. Dominic's head snapped back to her, a flash of irritation breaking through the misery. Are you deaf? I'm telling you I'm letting you go. I'm giving you an out from this corpse. You aren't a corpse. I am paralyzed from the waist down. Claire! He shouted, throwing the duvet off. He gestured violently to his own legs, resting motionless against the white sheets. They're dead. I can't feel them. I can't move them. I can't do a damn thing with them. I can't even stand up to look my own wife in the eye. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling heavily. The vulnerability in his eyes was blinding. The feared mafia boss, the ruthless predator of the North End, was begging her to understand his humiliation. I'm a ghost, he whispered, the anger breaking into a quiet, devastating ache. I can't offer you a real marriage. I can't give you what you need. He choked on the words, pride fighting a losing battle against the crushing reality of his anatomy. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a toxic mixture of self-loathing and a desperate, suffocating longing. He leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling, refusing to let a tear fall. He gripped the sheets until his knuckles ached. I'm still a man, Claire. He whispered into the dark, the words sounding more like an apology than a declaration. But barely. Claire didn't move for a long second. She looked at the man in the bed. She looked at the heavy, motionless legs. She looked at the broad, powerful chest, the scarred hands, the sharp, intelligent eyes that were currently trying to hide from her. She felt a sudden, fierce rush of heat in her chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was a weak, useless emotion. It was something far more dangerous. It was a fierce, possessive anger. Not at him, but for him. She climbed onto the bed. Dominic stiffened as the mattress shifted. What are you doing? I told you to pack your bags. Claire ignored him. She crawled over the heavy duvet, moving until she was kneeling right beside him. She reached out and grabbed his jaw. She didn't do it gently. Her fingers pressed firmly into his skin, forcing his face turned toward hers. His eyes widened in shock. No one touched Dominic Russo like that. Not before the bullet, and certainly not after. Listen to me very carefully, Dominic, she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. Her face was inches from his. She could feel his erratic breath against her skin. I didn't marry a pair of legs. I married the man who built an empire before he was 30. I married a man whose brain is sharper than anyone sitting at that dining room table. I married a man. Dominic stared at her, his breath hitching. He tried to pull his face away, defensive against hope. Claire, you don't understand. No, you don't understand. She interrupted, her grip on his jaw, tightening just a fraction, keeping him anchored to her eyes. Carmine wants your chair. He can try to take it. But he'll have to go through me first. You think you're broken because you can't walk, fine. I'll be your legs. You think you can't protect me, fine. I'll protect you. Dominic's pulse was hammering against her thumb. The sheer proximity of her, the smell of her skin, the absolute lack of fear in her eyes was short-circuiting his brain. "Why?" he choked out. "Why would you stay?" Claire didn't answer with words. She shifted her weight, moving closer, essentially straddling his motionless hips. Dominic sucked in a sharp breath, his hands instinctively coming up to grab her waist, his powerful upper body acting on pure reflex. She leaned down until her lips were brushing against the rough scruff of his jaw. "Because pity is for the weak," she whispered against his skin, her breath sending a shiver down his spine. "And you, Dominic Russo, are the most dangerous man I've ever met." She turned her head and captured his lips. Claire and Dominic shared an intense emotional kiss that released 4 months of bottled-up tension. At first, Dominic froze, overwhelmed by the moment, but he quickly responded with equal desperation. Their kiss became a powerful expression of their fear, frustration, longing, and the undeniable realization that they were both still alive and deeply connected. When they finally broke apart, both of them were gasping for air. Dominic stared up at her, his chest heaving, his dark eyes wide, and completely blown out with shock and a sudden terrifying glimmer of hope. Claire looked down at him, her lips swollen, her eyes burning with a fierce, unyielding loyalty. "You are my husband." She breathed, her hands resting flat against his chest, feeling the powerful, steady thud of his heart. "And you are going to rule this city. From that chair or this bed. Do you understand me?" Dominic looked at the woman sitting on top of him. The pawn had just flipped the entire board. A slow, genuine smile, the first one she had ever seen, broke through the dark shadows of his face. It was a predator's smile. "I understand," he murmured, his hands sliding up to cup her face, pulling her back down into the dark. Morning sunlight sliced through the heavy velvet drapes of the library, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the sterile air. The room smelled of old paper leather and the sharp medicinal tang of rubbing alcohol. Dominic was on the mat. His physical therapist, a broad-shouldered kid named Brian, had his hands firmly planted on Dominic's right calf and heel. Brian pushed, forcing the dead limb upward toward Dominic's chest to stretch the hip flexor. Dominic's jaw was locked so tight the muscles leapt beneath his skin. He was propped up on his elbows, sweat soaking through the thin cotton of his grey t-shirt. It was a humiliating posture. It was an excruciating process. Every stretch pulled at nerves that misfired, sending phantom electric shocks up his spine. Normally, this was the part where Dominic threw a towel at the wall, cursed Brian out of the room, and demanded his bourbon. Today, he just closed his eyes and breathed through his teeth. "Hold it," Brian muttered, bearing down on the leg. 10 seconds, boss. You're tighter than usual." Dominic didn't answer. He focused on the ceiling molding. He focused on the fact that he needed his body pliable. He needed to be able to sit in his chair for 8 hours without his hamstrings cramping into a violent spasm. He needed to function. Across the room, behind the massive oak desk that Dominic's father had imported from Sicily, sat Claire. She wore a simple tailored navy blouse. Her hair was pulled back into a severe clip. The mahogany surface in front of her was buried under the leather-bound ledgers Carmine had brought the day before. She wasn't reading a novel anymore. She was reading the lifeblood of the Russo Syndicate. 2 more seconds, Brian said, easing the leg back down to the mat with a heavy thud. "All right, let's do the left. Then we work on the transfer board." Dominic grunted an acknowledgement. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and turned his head to look at his wife. Claire had a silver fountain pen caught between her teeth. Her brow was furrowed, her finger tracing a line down a column of handwritten numbers. She flipped a page back, then forward, then back again. "He's padding the construction numbers," she said, not looking up. The quiet scratch of her pen on a notepad was the only sound in the room, besides Dominic's heavy breathing. "The union payouts?" Dominic asked, his voice strained as Brian wrenched his left leg up. "Yes." Claire finally looked up, tapping the ledger. "Sullivan's union envelope is supposed to be $50,000 a month. Carmine has $75,000 logged here for the last 3 months under the South Boston project. Either Sullivan suddenly got very expensive, or your underboss is skimming 25 grand off the top and blaming the unions." Dominic felt a cold, familiar calm settle over his chest. The pain in his spine retreated, replaced by the sharp, analytical focus that had made him a boss at 28. "Carmine thinks I'm too doped up on painkillers to read the books," Dominic said softly. "He thinks you're too busy staring out the window," Claire corrected, brutally honest. She closed the ledger. "If he's skimming, he's building a war chest. You don't steal from the family unless you're planning to leave it or take it over." "He's planning to take it over." Dominic pushed himself up into a sitting position as Brian backed away. "He's been planting seeds for months, whispering to the capos that I'm unfit. The stunt at the table yesterday. He was hoping for a show, and he almost got one," Claire said evenly. Dominic looked at her. Really looked at her. There was no pity in her eyes, no lingering trace of the frightened girl who had stood at the altar 4 months ago. The kiss last night hadn't been a magic cure. It hadn't fixed his spinal cord, but it had cauterized the bleeding in his head. She had demanded he be a man, and he was realizing that manhood had absolutely nothing to do with the dead weight of his legs. "Help me up," Dominic said to Brian. The therapist moved in with the polished wooden transfer board, sliding it under Dominic's hip. With a practiced fluid motion that still required immense upper body strength, Dominic braced his arms, lifted his torso, and slid across the board into the waiting wheelchair. He adjusted his legs onto the footrests himself, his hands moving with mechanical efficiency. He wheeled himself around the desk, stopping right beside Claire's chair. He reached out and picked up the ledger. "Call Sullivan," Dominic ordered, his eyes scanning the numbers. "The union rep," Claire asked. "Carmine usually handles him." "Carmine is done handling things. Have Sullivan brought here. Tonight at 8. Dominic tossed the ledger back onto the desk. "He likes his whiskey neat and he's afraid of dogs. Have Thomas bring the cane corso up from the kennels and put him in the hall." Claire's lips twitched into a microscopic smirk. "Intimidation tactics. Psychological warfare," Dominic corrected, leaning back in his chair. "I can't stand up and break his jaw anymore, Claire, so I have to break his mind before he even walks into the room. Let's see how brave Mr. Sullivan is when he's forced to look the ghost in the eye." Frank Sullivan was a man who sweated when he lied. Right now, sitting in the center of the Rousseau Library, he was sweating through his cheap tweed suit. It was 8:15 p.m. The library was deliberately underlit, the only illumination coming from a pair of heavy brass lamps that cast long, ominous shadows against the walls. Dominic didn't sit behind his desk. He sat in the dead center of the room in his wheelchair, completely exposed. There was no desk to hide his legs. There was no blanket covering his lap. He wore a sharply tailored black suit, the creases in his trousers perfect. He sat perfectly still, his hands steepled under his chin, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the union rep. He looked exactly like a king on a chrome throne. Claire stood in the shadows near the bar cart. She poured a glass of cheap bourbon, not the good crystal decanter, and walked it over to Sullivan. She didn't say a word. She just handed it to him and stepped back, folding her arms, her presence a silent, chilling endorsement of her husband's authority. Outside the heavy oak doors, the low, guttural growl of a 140-pound guard dog rumbled through the floorboards. Sullivan flinched, gripping the glass tight. "Frank!" Dominic's voice was a low, resonant hum. It filled the large room effortlessly. "You look nervous." "No, Mr. Russo, just tired. Long day at the docks." Sullivan stammered, taking a hasty gulp of the bourbon. He coughed, unaccustomed to the harsh burn. "I was surprised to get the call. Usually Carmine comes down to the site." "Carmine is an employee," Dominic said slowly, letting the word hang in the air like a noose. "I am the employer, and recently I've been reviewing our payroll." Sullivan swallowed hard. His eyes darted to Dominic's motionless legs, then quickly snapped back up to his face, terrified of being caught looking. "You threatened a strike yesterday," Dominic continued. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quietness made it infinitely more dangerous. "You told Carmine the envelope was too light, that your men were restless." "Well, inflation, you know how it is, Mr. Russo. The cost of living." Dominic interrupted his tone, flattening into absolute ice. "Is exactly what I decide it is. I pay you $50,000 a month to ensure the concrete pours on time, and the inspectors look the other way. That is the arrangement." Sullivan wiped his brow with a crumpled handkerchief. "Carmine said. He said you guys could do 75. He said you authorized it. Did he?" Dominic leaned forward slightly. His core muscles held him perfectly steady. "Because my ledgers say 75,000 left my accounts, but my instincts say 50,000 went into your pocket and 25,000 went into Carmine's." Sullivan froze. The color drained from his face entirely. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then looked desperately toward the door, as if the growling dog was suddenly preferable to the man in the chair. I don't know what Carmine does with his cut, Mr. Russo. I swear to God, he just hands me the envelope. I don't ask questions." "You're asking for a strike," Dominic pointed out. "That was Carmine's idea." The words tumbled out of Sullivan's mouth in a panicked rush. He was breaking exactly as Dominic knew he would. The man was a coward, emboldened only by Carmine's assurances. "He told me to push back. He told me to make a stink about the money, so he could go to the capos and say things were falling apart on the street. He said you were—" Sullivan choked on the words, his eyes terrified. "Paralyzed." Dominic finished for him. The word didn't carry the sting it had yesterday. It was just a fact now, a strategic data point. "Week done." Sullivan nodded miserably, looking down at his scuffed shoes. Dominic sat back in his chair. He looked at Claire. She gave him a slow, infinitesimal nod. The trap had snapped shut. They had the confession. They had the proof of a coup. "Here is what is going to happen. Frank," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on Sullivan's arms stand up. "You are going to call off the strike. Tomorrow morning, your men are going to pour concrete faster than they ever have in their miserable lives. You will accept the 50,000. And if you ever speak to Carmine without my explicit permission again, I won't send a dog to the docks. I'll send Trent." Trent was the enforcer, the man who didn't leave witnesses. Sullivan physically shuddered at the name. "Yes, Mr. Russo, absolutely. Understood." Sullivan set the half-empty glass on a side table, his hands shaking violently. "Get out!" Sullivan didn't need to be told twice. He practically scrambled for the door, slipping out into the hallway, leaving the heavy scent of fear behind him. The library fell silent again. Dominic stared at the closed door for a long moment. He could feel the familiar burn of nerve pain creeping up his lower back, the physical toll of sitting rigid and projecting absolute dominance for 20 minutes. But beneath the pain there was a profound, vibrating surge of adrenaline. He turned his chair toward Claire. She was already walking toward him, holding a fresh glass of bourbon, from the crystal decanter this time. She handed it to him. He'll run straight to Carmine to warn him, Claire said, her eyes calculating. I know. Dominic took the glass, his fingers brushing against hers. Let him. I want Carmine to know I see him. Let him panic. Men make mistakes when they panic. Claire stepped closer, resting her hand on the armrest of his wheelchair. It was a casual gesture, but in their world, it was an unbreakable seal of partnership. You handled him perfectly, she said softly. Dominic looked up at her, the dark flint of his eyes catching the lamplight. He didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He felt like the boss of the North End. We handled him, Dominic corrected, taking a sip of the burning liquid. Now we prepare for a war. The warning didn't come in the form of a scream or a siren. It came as a profound, unnatural silence. At 2:14 a.m., the heavy rain lashing against the bedroom windows masked most of the ambient noise from the estate grounds. But Dominic Russo didn't listen to the rain. He listened to the rhythm of his house, and the rhythm was broken. The Cane Corso patrolling the lower hall had been letting out low, intermittent barks at the thunder for the last hour. Suddenly the barking stopped. It didn't taper off into a whine. It was cut short, severed. Dominic's eyes snapped open in the pitch black. He didn't bolt upright. He couldn't. Instead, he reached a heavy, scarred hand out and clamped it over Claire's mouth. She woke instantly, her body jerking in panic against the mattress. Shh! Dominic breathed his voice, a ghost of a whisper in her ear. He removed his hand. Don't scream. Don't turn on the light. Claire's breath hitched, but she obeyed. The street smarts she'd inherited from her father, a man who lived his whole life expecting a knife in the dark, overrode her terror. What is it? She whispered back. Carmine didn't wait, Dominic said flatly. The cold, analytical part of his brain was already mapping out the house, calculating response times. He panicked. He sent a crew. He threw the heavy duvet off his chest. The familiar, sickening reality of his paralysis hit him harder than usual. Before the bullet, he would have been out of bed in a fraction of a second, clearing the doorway, taking the fight to the hall. Now he was anchored to a king-sized mattress, a stationary target. Under my nightstand. Dominic ordered his hands, finding the edge of the mattress, bracing his upper body. There's a panel. Pull it down. Claire rolled over him, her bare knees digging into the sheets. She scrambled to his side of the bed, dropping to the floor. She fumbled in the dark, her fingers finding the smooth wood, then the hidden latch. It clicked. A heavy metal object dropped into her palm. She stood up, holding a suppressed Glock 19. It felt impossibly heavy. Give it to me, Dominic said. She placed the grip into his outstretched hand, his fingers wrapped around it with lethal familiarity. He checked the chamber entirely by touch. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, just outside their door. Get to the floor, Dominic commanded. Behind the bed. Do not stand up. Claire dropped flat against the carpet, just as the heavy oak bedroom doors splintered inward. The wood cracked with the force of a battering ram. Two men spilled into the room, their silhouettes backlit by the dim emergency lights in the hall. They had suppressed submachine guns, raised, sweeping the room. They expected to find a sleeping cripple. They expected an execution. They didn't expect Dominic Russo to be awake, propped up on his left elbow, the Glock leveled perfectly in the dark. Dominic fired twice. The suppressor coughed two dull, sharp thwips that barely registered over the storm outside. The first man folded instantly, a bullet catching him square in the throat. He hit the floor with a wet, heavy thud, his weapon clattering across the hardwood. The second man panicked blindly, squeezing the trigger of his weapon. A spray of suppressed gunfire chewed through the drywall and shattered the vanity mirror. Glass rained down in the dark. Dominic didn't flinch. He tracked the muzzle flash and fired again. The man grunted, spinning backward into the doorframe before collapsing into the hall. Silence descended again, thick and ringing. "Claire!" Dominic barked. "I'm here," she gasped from the floor. "I'm okay. They'll send more. The primary team just failed. The secondary will push the room." Dominic's voice was tight with exertion. He looked at the heavy reinforced door of the master bathroom across the suite. It was 10 feet away. A 3-second sprint for a healthy man. An ocean for him. His wheelchair was parked near the vanity, completely exposed to the doorway. It was useless. "We need the bathroom. It's lined with Kevlar plating," Dominic said. He holstered the gun into the waistband of his sweatpants. He grabbed the edge of the mattress and heaved his upper body forward. He didn't slide gracefully. He threw himself off the bed. His torso hit the floor hard, his shoulders taking the brunt of the impact. His legs followed a second later, dragging over the edge of the mattress and slamming onto the hardwood like 2 sacks of wet sand. The sound was brutal, entirely devoid of dignity. Claire scrambled out from behind the bed. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask if he was hurt. There was no time for the luxury of pity. She grabbed him by the back of his shirt, digging her hands under his armpits. "I've got you," she gritted out. "Pull!" Dominic ordered, digging his elbows into the floor, using his massive upper body strength to drag himself backward toward the bathroom, while Claire pulled with everything she had. Her bare feet slipped on the wood. Her muscles burned. He was 200 pounds of dead weight from the waist down. They moved in agonizing inches, a desperate, frantic scramble across the floorboards. Another set of heavy footsteps pounded up the main staircase. "Faster," Dominic hissed. They breached the bathroom threshold just as a third shadow appeared in the bedroom doorway. Dominic twisted his torso, drawing the Glock in one fluid motion, and fired blindly toward the movement. Claire slammed the heavy reinforced door shut and threw the steel deadbolt. A second later, a hail of bullets slammed into the outside of the door, the Kevlar core absorbing the impacts with dull, heavy thuds. Inside the pitch-black bathroom, Claire collapsed against the door, sliding down until she hit the cold tile floor. Her chest heaved, pulling in frantic, ragged breaths. Beside her in the dark, Dominic lay on his back. His gun was still aimed at the door, his breathing steady, controlled. They were trapped, but they were alive. For 20 agonizing minutes, the estate was a war zone. Through the thick reinforced door, they heard the muffled chaos of a hostile takeover, crashing headfirst into the Russo family's loyalist guards. Shouts, the chatter of automatic fire, the heavy concussive boom of a shotgun. Dominic hadn't moved from the floor. He sat propped against the edge of the marble-soaking tub, his legs sprawled awkwardly in front of him. He held the Glock perfectly steady, his eyes locked on the steel deadbolt. Claire sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest. She was shaking a fine, uncontrollable tremor, born of receding adrenaline. Then the gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a coin toss. Either Carmine's men were taking the house, or Trent and the Loyalists had held the line. Footsteps approached the master suite. Slow, methodical. Dominic's thumb clicked the safety off his weapon. The metallic snap echoed sharply in the cavernous bathroom. A heavy fist pounded on the door. 2 knocks. Pause. 1 knock. It was the syndicate code. "Boss!" A rough, gravelly voice called out through the wood. It was Trent. "House is clear. We have casualties, but the perimeter is secured. The rats are dead." Dominic let out a long, slow breath. He lowered the gun, resting it on the tiles. "Wait in the hall, Trent. Secure the floor." "Yes, sir." The immediate threat was gone. The adrenaline began to bleed out of the room, leaving behind the cold, harsh reality of the aftermath. The bathroom was freezing. The marble tiles bit into Claire's bare legs. She finally turned to look at her husband. The emergency lights kicked on, bathing the bathroom in a low amber glow. Dominic looked exhausted. His grey t-shirt was bunched up, revealing angry red scrapes across his ribs from dragging himself across the floorboards. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. He was staring at his legs. It wasn't a look of anger this time. It was a look of profound, quiet defeat. He had survived, but he had done it crawling on his belly like a wounded animal. The indignity of the escape was eating him alive. Claire pushed herself off the door. She crawled across the tiles until she was sitting directly in front of him. She reached out and gently straightened his right leg, moving it from its twisted, unnatural angle until it rested straight on the floor. She did the same with the left. She arranged him with a quiet, careful dignity. Dominic watched her, his jaw tight. "I couldn't protect you." He rasped the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "If they had breached that door, I couldn't have gotten you out. You shot 2 men in the dark," Claire said, her voice steady, stripping the emotion from the facts. "You got us in here. You saved my life, Dominic. I dragged myself across my own bedroom floor." He looked up at the ceiling, refusing to meet her eyes. His voice cracked, stripped of all its hardened armor. "I am a liability. Carmine was right. A boss who can't stand his ground is dead weight." Claire felt a sudden sharp sting in her palm. She looked down. During the scramble to open the hidden compartment, she had cut her hand on a piece of shattered glass from the vanity. Blood was welling up thick and dark, smearing across her palm. She didn't grab a towel. She didn't flinch. She reached out and pressed her bloody palm flat against the center of Dominic's chest, right over his heart. Dominic flinched at the cold wetness, his eyes snapping down to her hand and then up to her face. "Do you feel that?" Claire asked, her voice fierce, cutting through his self-pity like a scalpel. "You're bleeding," he said, his brow furrowing in alarm. He reached to grab her wrist, but she pushed harder against his chest, holding him in place. "I asked if you feel that," she repeated. Dominic stopped fighting. He looked at her eyes. They were dark, wild, and completely fearless. "I feel it," he whispered. "Good. Because that is the only blood we spill tonight," Claire said. She leaned in her face, inches from his. The smell of gunpowder and copper hung between them. "You think standing your ground requires legs? Standing your ground requires this." She tapped her free hand against his temple. "Carmine has 2 working legs, and he just lost a war to a man sitting in a bed. He is stupid. You are dangerous." She pulled her hand back from his chest, leaving a dark, bloody handprint on the grey cotton of his shirt. A brutal, visceral mark of ownership. "You are going to let Trent put you back in your chair," Claire told him, her tone leaving zero room for debate. "You are going to put on a clean suit, and you are going to call a meeting of the remaining capos in the library at sunrise. You are going to show them exactly what happens when someone tries to kill the boss of the North End." Dominic stared at her. The crushing weight of his physical limitations, which had been threatening to drown him just seconds ago, shattered against the sheer, unyielding force of her will. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was his armor. He looked at the bloody handprint on his chest. Then he looked back at the woman who put it there. A low, dark chuckle rumbled in his throat. It was a terrifying sound. It was the sound of a predator waking up. "You're ruthless, Claire," he murmured, reaching up to cup the side of her face. His thumb gently brushed against her cheekbone. "I'm a Russo. she replied, simply leaning into his touch. Dominic's eyes softened a crack of genuine, overwhelming affection, breaking through the violence of the night. He pulled her forward, pressing his forehead against hers. They sat there, on the freezing marble, surrounded by the wreckage of their home, breathing in the same air. "Go tell Trent to bring the transfer board," Dominic whispered against her skin. "I have a syndicate to clean up." Dawn broke over the city in bruised shades of purple and grey. Inside the Russo estate, the smell of cordite and bleach hung heavy in the air, a chemical testament to the violence that had just washed through the halls. The library was immaculate. The broken glass had been swept away, the blood scrubbed from the marble foyer outside. Dominic sat behind the massive oak desk. He wore a crisp white shirt, a black silk tie, and a charcoal suit jacket. The tailoring was flawless. He looked like a man who had slept 8 hours, not a man who had dragged himself across a floorboard to survive an execution. His hands were folded neatly on the pristine desk blotter. To his left, standing exactly 1 step behind his chair, was Claire. She wore a dark, high-necked dress. The cut on her palm was bandaged with white gauze, stark against the dark fabric of her skirt. Standing in front of the desk were Vitiello and Paulie. They looked hollowed out. Their eyes kept darting to the closed double doors behind them, then back to the man in the wheelchair. They knew the perimeter had been breached. They knew blood had been spilled. What they didn't know was how the man sitting in front of them, who couldn't feel his own toes, was the one who had orchestrated the cleanup. The heavy doors groaned open. Trent walked in his suit jacket off his white shirt, stained with rust-colored smears. He was dragging a man by the collar. He threw Carmine onto the Persian rug. The underboss hit the floor hard. He didn't look like a usurper anymore. His lip was split, his left eye was swelling shut, and his breath rattled in his chest. He looked up, coughing, and his eyes met Dominic's. Dominic didn't say a word. He just stared. The silence stretched for 10 excruciating seconds. Paulie shifted his weight, his dress shoes squeaking faintly on the wood. Vitiello swallowed audibly. "You look tired, Carmine," Dominic finally said. His voice was a calm, flat expanse of ice. Carmine pushed himself up onto his knees. He spat a wad of blood onto the rug. "You got lucky, Dom. Your loyalists, they fought like dogs." "I didn't need the loyalists for the 2 men you sent to my bedroom," Dominic replied evenly. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the heavy black Glock 19, and placed it onto the desk with a heavy clack. "I handled them myself." Carmine's good eye widened. He looked at the gun, then up at Dominic, the realization sinking in like a stone in deep water. He had underestimated the ghost. "You thought the chair made me deaf," Dominic said, leaning forward. His broad shoulders blocked the morning light from the window, casting a long shadow over the kneeling man. "You thought it made me blind. You thought because I couldn't walk down to the docks I couldn't see you bleeding the unions. You thought because my legs are dead, my mind was too. Dom, listen. I listened to you for 4 months." Dominic cut him off the volume of his voice, never rising above a conversational hum. That was what made it terrifying. "I listened to you whisper to my cousins. I listened to you pad the ledgers. And last night, I listened to your men kick down my door while my wife was sleeping." At the mention of her, Carmine's eyes flicked to Claire. He saw the bandage on her hand. He saw the cold, unblinking way she was looking at him. There was no mercy there. "She's a smart girl," Carmine rasped, a desperate, bitter sneer curling his bleeding lip. "She knows a sinking ship when she sees one. How long until she gets tired of playing nurse, Dom? How long until she wants a real man?" The air in the room evaporated. Vitiello closed his eyes, bracing for the explosion. Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the gun. He simply turned his head and looked at his wife. Claire stepped out from behind the chair. She walked around the desk, her heels clicking methodically on the hardwood. She stopped 2 feet from Carmine. She looked down at the ruined, pathetic man kneeling on the floor. "You sent killers into my home," Claire said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of any theatrical anger. It was purely transactional. "You ruined my dining room table, and you made my husband drag himself across the floor. You are a stupid, sloppy man, Carmine." She turned her back to him, entirely dismissing his existence, and walked back to Dominic's side. She picked up the silver coffee pot from the side table and poured a black stream into Dominic's cup. Dominic took the cup. He took a slow sip. "Take him to the warehouse," Dominic said, looking over his coffee cup at Trent. "Make sure he understands exactly what happens to rats before you end it. Then leave him in the trunk of Sullivan's car at the docks. The union needs a reminder of who signs their checks." Trent nodded his face, a mask of brutal efficiency. He grabbed Carmine by the back of the neck, hauling him to his feet. Carmine didn't scream. The fight had been entirely bled out of him. He was dragged out of the library, his scuffed shoes leaving drag marks on the rug. When the doors clicked shut, Dominic turned his attention to Vitiello and Paulie. "There is a new structure as of this morning," Dominic said. "Trent is stepping up. He takes Carmine's territory. You two will report directly to me every Tuesday with the ledgers. If a single cent is unaccounted for, you don't answer to the capos. You answer to Trent. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, boss," Paulie stammered, nodding rapidly. Vitiello echoed the sentiment, his face pale. "Good. Get out." The 2 capos practically ran for the door. When the room was finally empty, the heavy silence returned. But it wasn't the suffocating, toxic silence of the past 4 months. It was the quiet of a settled storm. Dominic set his coffee cup down. He looked at the gun on his desk. Then he looked at Claire. "You didn't flinch," he noted softly. "Neither did you," she replied. She reached out her unbandaged hand, resting on his shoulder. Dominic reached up, covering her hand with his own. He rubbed his thumb over her knuckles. He was the undisputed king of the city again, and he knew exactly who had handed him back his crown. Winter arrived in the city with a bitter, unforgiving chill. Snow piled up against the wrought-iron gates of the Russo estate, blanketing the grounds in pristine white. Inside the master suite, the fireplace was roaring, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the dark wood and heavy velvet. It was late. The house was quiet. Dominic was sitting on the edge of the mattress. The wheelchair was parked securely next to the nightstand. There was no physical therapist in the room. There was no night nurse hovering in the hallway. He had fired Thomas 3 weeks ago. He gripped the wooden transfer board with his left hand, his right hand planted firmly on the mattress. His biceps bunched thick and corded with new muscle. He had spent the last 3 months attacking his upper body in the estate's gym with a brutal, relentless discipline. If he was going to be confined to the chair, he was going to turn his torso into a weapon. With a smooth, powerful grunt of exertion, he lifted his weight, swinging his hips across the board and settling back against the pillows. He reached down, grabbing his heavy, motionless legs one by one, and pulled them up onto the mattress, straightening them out. He didn't hate the process anymore. It was just mechanics. The bathroom door clicked open. Claire walked out, the steam trailing behind her. She wore a simple, white silk robe, her damp hair falling around her shoulders. She walked over to the bed, dropping the robe, and slid under the heavy down comforter next to him. The cold radiating off her skin was a sharp, pleasant contrast to the heat of the fire. Dominic turned his head, watching her settle in. The fierce, untouchable mob wife, who terrified capos in the library, softened instantly in the dark of their room. He reached out, tracing the line of her jaw with 2 fingers. "You're freezing," he murmured, his voice a low gravel. "Warm me up, then," she challenged softly, her eyes holding his. Dominic didn't hesitate. He shifted his weight, pulling her firmly against his side. His arm wrapped around her waist, anchoring her to his chest. He couldn't feel her legs tangling with his beneath the sheets, but he could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of her heart against his ribs. He could feel the soft breath escaping her lips as she buried her face in the crook of his neck. "Trent handled the docks today," Dominic said, quietly staring at the ceiling. "Sullivan is falling in line. The revenue is up 12%. "I know," Claire said, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on his chest. "I checked the ledgers before dinner." He let out a short, genuine laugh. "You're going to put my accountants out of business. Someone has to make sure you aren't getting robbed while you're busy glaring at people," she teased. The humor faded, leaving a comfortable, intimate quiet. Dominic tightened his grip on her slightly. He thought about the night Carmine's men had breached the house. He thought about the blood on his chest, the raw, terrifying vulnerability of crawling on the floor, and the absolute lack of fear in his wife's eyes. "I thought about letting him go. You know," Dominic confessed into the dark. Claire stopped tracing. "Carmine." "No." He swallowed hard. "Before all this. That night in this bed. When I told you I'd draw up the divorce papers. I thought about just surrendering. Letting Carmine take the streets, taking a settlement, and fading away into a clinic somewhere. It would have been easier." Claire tilted her head up, resting her chin on his chest so she could look him in the eye. "Why didn't you?" Dominic looked down at her. He saw the firelight reflecting in her eyes. He saw the woman who had deliberately tripped over a rug to save his pride. The woman who had pressed her bleeding hand to his heart and demanded he act like a king. "Because you wouldn't let me," he whispered, bringing his hand up to cup the back of her neck. His fingers tangled in her damp hair. "You looked at a ghost and told him to haunt the city." "I looked at a man," Claire corrected fiercely. "I never saw a ghost." Dominic's chest tightened. The residual shame, the lingering anger at his own broken spine, it didn't disappear entirely. It probably never would. But in the dark, with her weight anchored against him, it didn't matter. He didn't need legs to protect her. He didn't need legs to rule. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a slow, deep kiss. It was possessive, heavily laden with gratitude and a dark, burning devotion. Claire kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands sliding up into his hair, pulling him closer. When he finally pulled back to breathe, resting his forehead against hers, he felt entirely whole. "I'm still a man, Claire." He murmured the words, no longer a desperate plea, but an undeniable fact. "I know," she whispered against his lips, her grip on him tightening. "You're exactly the man I need." When the world tries to break you down to your physical limitations, true power is found in the mind, the will, and the unyielding loyalty of the person standing beside you. Dominic Russo lost his legs, but through Claire's absolute refusal to let him surrender, he found his empire. Their story proves that strength isn't about how you stand, but how you fight when you're forced to the floor. If this gritty, deeply human tale of survival and dark romance kept you hooked, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story of resilience, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more intense, dramatic storytelling. Leave a comment below what was your favorite moment of Claire's absolute ruthlessness. See you in the next one.